Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Michelle Teo, and I am a health coach team leader with Zevo Health. So for today's webinar, I'm going to be discussing how we create a psychologically safe workplace for employees during the transition of returning back to the office through this current pandemic. So on today's agenda, I will be discussing the psychological impact of the coronavirus, and then I'll be diving into understanding what psychological safety means and what it looks like. And finally, I will be looking at the various moving pieces of a proactive approach to assist your employees through this transition back to the office, which can help ensure that your workplace remains effective. So before we dive into the material, I'll ask you to engage with me in this activity. So either grab yourself a piece of paper and a pen, or just use a note in your phone. And for the next 20 seconds, I would like you to write down anything that comes to your mind when I say a particular word. And I'll tell you when to stop. So if you're ready, your word is coronavirus. Just taking the next 20 seconds now to write down any words that are coming to your mind when you hear the word coronavirus. 5 more seconds. And stop. So when I did this activity, these are some of the words that I listed. And what you will notice is some of them are objects or things like a mask, hand sanitizer, toilet paper. Others are feelings like angry, anxiety, fear. And then finally, some are behaviors or actions like work from home, like distance or isolation. And what this simple word association exercise can help us to see is the psychological impact that the pandemic has had on us over the last couple of months. So generally, the psychological impact of any given situation, whether it's a pleasant or unpleasant situation, can fall into 3 categories: our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. So through the pandemic, we may have experienced thoughts like, what if I contract the coronavirus? I can't stay home for another week. I miss my family so much. And with that comes certain feelings. So these can be wide-ranging. We may have experienced a sense of relief initially when we were sent to work from home. And then this may have transitioned into anger about the extended lockdown period and not being allowed to see our closest friends and family. More recently, you may be experiencing anger again, but towards friends who are traveling if you still feel like this is an unsafe experience. And there's also been a lot of fear, loneliness, anxiety, and helplessness that people are experiencing around the world. On the other end of the spectrum, you may have also experienced a sense of gratitude for the amount of time you've gotten to spend with children and with partners. And in fact, you probably have experienced many of these feelings simultaneously. So when it comes to our thoughts and our feelings, we have probably experienced similar thoughts or the same feelings around different circumstances. So for example, it's not uncommon for a foreign national living in a different country from their family to think, I miss my family so much. And it's not uncommon for us to feel lonely sometimes. But what's different is maybe the behaviors through this pandemic. So things like buying excess amounts of toilet paper, engaging in home workouts for someone who traditionally goes to the gym, or wearing a mask on public transport or washing your hands so frequently are probably new behaviors that we have had to take on simply because of the coronavirus pandemic. And while we are still in the midst of a pandemic, understanding the psychological impact it has had on us and will continue to have on us is extremely important. So what we are currently experiencing is a stress response, and this is because there is a threat to our safety and well-being. Now, normally, our responses to stress are either fight, flight, or freeze, and this has a very strong evolutionary basis. So if you think back to the hunter and gatherer days, if you were a caveman, a lion in those days might have been a potential threat to your safety. Now, if a lion were to come into your cave, then this would have been a very stressful experience, and your sympathetic nervous system would have kicked in, redirecting all the adrenaline in your body to your muscles to engage in some kind of action, and then to your brain to make quick decisions. And in response to this, you might have grabbed your spear and tried to fight the lion. You might have tried to run away or flee from the lion, or you might have been so shocked and fearful that you froze on the very spot. Returning to office is a similar response, albeit it's not a lion that we're fearful of. Now it is the coronavirus. So there's still a great deal of uncertainty around a second or third wave, the economy, how we keep ourselves safe, around a vaccine, and many of the unpleasant thoughts and feelings that I talked about earlier are probably still very present for us, and even more may become part of our experience when returning to the office. So the whole transition back to the office also necessitates another change in our behaviors. And the only difference between the situation of a caveman and the current pandemic we are experiencing is that the threat to our safety and well-being has been ongoing for an extended period of time. So this means that we are more likely experiencing a chronic stress response, which can exhibit as chronic fatigue, feelings of detachment, and an overall sense of burnout. The nature of this ongoing stress response means that we need to be more mindful of how we keep ourselves safe. And as employers, it also means recognizing that your employees are having this experience and that it may be taking a toll on their mental health. So you as an employer will need to ensure their health and safety more critically, both physically and mentally, throughout the transition back to the office. And this is where psychological safety comes in. So in organizational psychology, psychological safety can be defined as people's perceptions of the consequences of taking interpersonal risks in any particular context. So psychological safety is a combination of employees' perception that they can contribute ideas and actions, and also that they can share information and knowledge. And the combination of these two things enables organizational and team learning. So Kahn says that psychological safety affects individuals' willingness to employ or express themselves physically, cognitively, and emotionally during role performances, rather than disengaging or withdrawing and defending their personal selves. In the most basic of terms, if an employee feels psychologically secure, they're more likely to contribute to their role rather than spending time defending their position, which is why it's so important. And further to that, psychological safety in the working environment is linked to having effective work environments. So one study conducted by Collins and Smith over 10 months amongst 136 high-tech companies included HR managers, core knowledge workers, and even CEOs. And based on this research, what they found was that a social climate of trust and cooperation, significantly related to firm performance. So this was partially mediated by the levels of exchanges and a combination of ideas and knowledge among the knowledge workers. And what this shows us is that there is a relationship between how psychologically secure employees feel and the overall performance of an entire organization. So if we want to create effective work environments where employees can meet their deadlines, they can make significant contributions and improve the organization, we want employees that feel psychologically secure. Now, armed with this understanding of the impact of the coronavirus on your employees and what psychological safety in the workplace means, how can you use a proactive approach when returning to the office to ensure the continued mental well-being of your employees? So firstly, there are going to be logistical considerations that are related to the health and safety of your employees, such as the provision of personal protective equipment like face masks. There are going to be government guidelines that your organization needs to follow. It might be the number of employees that are allowed in your building site. And then there are probably also going to be new policies and procedures in place, such as something like a temperature check at the entryway. And while most of these logistical pieces are going to be within your control as an employer, being proactive also means that you are considering what is outside of your control. So for example, your employees may have varying attitudes about the different restrictions. There may be differences in how your employees respond to the news that they now have to return to the office. There's also going to be individual differences about how employees adhere to the new guidelines. And there are going to be certain employees who are considered high risk who are unable to return to the office. And lastly, there's also going to be a varying difference in the current mental state of your employees. So you may find out when you're communicating this transition back to the office that one of your employees suffers from chronic asthma. So what kind of accommodations can you make to ensure this person's health and safety? Or you might have an employee who can't find childcare at the moment or is simply refusing to return back to the office because they feel it's unsafe. So how do you cope with this type of situation as an employer? So let's break it down into 3 key areas when you're making considerations about communicating this transition to your employees to maintain their psychological safety. So the first is keeping your employees safe from psychological harm. And this traditionally includes things like bullying and harassment in the workplace. However, during the pandemic, it also means minimizing stress and anxiety related to returning to the office. Psychological safety also includes the ability for employees to do their work, to learn, and to thrive in their environment. And through a pandemic, this means that they can continue business as usual. So this is socializing with their colleagues, engaging in business meetings, completing tasks, and contributing to the wider organization, despite the new restrictions that might be in place. And finally, fostering psychological safety in the working environment means that employees' voices are heard. So there are various methods that we generally employ to ensure that our employees' voices are heard, including meetings, electronic communications like email, employee satisfaction surveys, town halls, etc. So we want to ensure that all 3 of these pieces are continuing to occur to ensure the psychological safety of our employees. So let's look at the more practical ways that we can actually do these 3 things. So keeping your employees safe from psychological harm. Firstly, being mindful of any Asian employees that are in your working environment. And this goes back to things like bullying and harassment. There is a link that people make between the coronavirus and China. which means that some of your Asian employees might be scrutinized, criticized, and you want to ensure that their working environment is still free of that bullying and harassment. You may have, as I mentioned before, high-risk employees who are unable to work from the office. So are you going to allow them to stay at home? And then in terms of other supports that you can provide in order to minimize anxiety and stressors, such as adjusted working hours or days, additional supports for those that need childcare, and things like transport. Working, learning, and thriving in their environment. So if you want to continue business as usual, room capacities may need to be reduced, but it doesn't mean that people can't sit face-to-face rather than engaging over VC as long as they're maintaining physical distance. So is that something you can accommodate as an employer? For those who are going to continue working at home and even those who are going back to the office, is there IT equipment that is going to be provided? And then finally, things like social breaks where you can maintain physical distance. So socializing is such an important part of working, learning, and thriving in our environments. And something as simple as a 10-minute morning walk or doing icebreaker activities with your employees who haven't seen each other for the last 4 or 5 months face-to-face is going to be really important to ensure that those relationships stay really strong. And finally, ensuring that people's voices are heard. So it might be one-to-one meetings that you're holding with individuals, or it might be group meetings, or it might be something as simple as a town hall where everyone joins in over VC and you get to speak to the whole group as one. It could be a survey that you send out, and it could be something as simple as an email. So the way that you communicate is often the most important part of ensuring psychological safety for your employees. I have talked about the ongoing psychological impact that we're currently experiencing through this pandemic, and the reason I have done so is to drive home this point. When individuals are under stress, they're less likely to be able to regulate their emotions. So you know yourself, if you've ever been in a stressful situation and then someone says something to you the wrong way, you're more likely to snap. So when we're communicating to others, we need to be more mindful of the potential impact it is going to have for them when they've been enduring a state of constant stress. So the best way to communicate during any phases of transition is always face-to-face. And this is more likely going to be video conference now if it's in group meetings. But while we can infer tone through email or other written communications, sometimes we get it wrong. So we've all had that experience where we read an email, we perceive a harsh tone from the sender, and then it's only later on when we speak to them face-to-face that we realize we didn't perceive the tone the right way. So when we see someone face-to-face, we can use visual cues and audio cues to help us understand the true meaning of their words. This is why I encourage these conversations to occur through video conference or phone calls or face-to-face, where it'll be easier for you to infer the tone. Where possible, I also encourage collaborative engagement throughout the process. So you want to think back to my last slide where I discussed practical methods to ensure your employees' voices are heard. Offering them choices, offering external supports, using surveys or town halls where employees can express their concerns, that is what we consider collaborative engagement. And that ensures psychological safety as long as you are willing to take their feedback and suggestions. And within any kind of communication that is going to potentially cause difficulties, it's imperative to remain as open-minded as possible, to minimize judgments, and to use empathy and compassion. So putting yourself in another person's shoes, which is what we call empathy, allows you to really understand their point of view. And sometimes someone's point of view can be very different to our own. So this is particularly important because, as I mentioned previously, there are certain things that you cannot control, such as your employees' attitudes, their responses, and how they adhere to the new guidelines. You may have employees who feel angry about this transition or extremely fearful for their health and safety. You may have employees who return to the office and don't adhere to physical distancing measures or don't want to wear a mask. And then on the other hand, you may have certain employees who are very open to returning back to the office and willing to adhere to all of the new procedures. If you remain empathic and compassionate in your conversations with your employees, then you're more likely to foster a sense of psychological safety where they are willing to express their true selves and express their true concerns. So what are some of the key takeaways from today's webinar? Firstly, the coronavirus pandemic has been stressful and mentally exhausting on everyone, including yourself and your employees. So we need to be aware of this psychological impact and understand that this is also going to have implications on our attitudes and our responses to returning back to the office. Secondly, effective work environments come from an atmosphere of psychological safety. So research shows that if employees feel heard and can contribute and share ideas openly as themselves without needing to be defensive, this correlates with positive firm performance. And finally, through any communications, it'll be imperative for you to use your empathy and compassion skills. Allowing your employees to express their concerns without fear or judgment and trying to be as open-minded as possible is how we have the most collaborative and thriving environment. At the end of the day, your organization needs your employees to run effectively. So if you can create an environment where your employees feel valued, then you're more likely to see the fruits of their labor in a positive way. So I thank you very much for taking the time today to tune into my webinar, and I hope that this has been helpful to you. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to us at Zevo Health, and I hope that you continue to keep yourself safe and as well as you can be. Thank you very much.